So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay and to a custom scenario actually, and it's one of quite a few that I got given shortly before Christmas and the turn of the new year, and now that we are within January I will be able to start recording them. And this one, as I'm sure you can tell from the structure in the distance, the winding river and the city that is positioned just so, this is meant to be a facsimile of Dale and Erebor, and it's a different variant on this map than the ones we've seen in the past. You can see the tower on the hill, the main city is fairly big, and most versions of Dale that we tend to see are fairly sprawling. It doesn't have the walls of Dale, but I think this is mainly for gameplay reasons, and I feel as though this battle has got a lot of potential actually. I think this is one of my more favoured looks for this particular location. Many of the maps we've seen in the past have either been really far too big or far too simple, and Dale itself is kind of difficult to make. The actual version of Dale that we've seen in the past is all well and good of course, but it is its own entity, whereas if you want to have more of the look with Erebor in the background and other aspects on the map, you have to scale back Dale itself at least a little bit because of the limitations that you have to work with in Medieval 2. So yeah, this should be interesting. The Flame of Arnor is the player who gave me this battle replay and I believe created the custom scenario as well. There is another one coming from him as well as a few from Tommy the Wise, and a couple of other people as well. So definitely got a rich pickings when it comes to this sort of thing moving forward, which is always good because it's usually a sign that completely new maps have been made for it, which is always nice to see. It's nice to have new content to look upon. So as for the city itself, it is relatively open as a result of it lacking its walls essentially, which will help the attackers as the Dale is beset on all sides and the dwarves will be marching down from the Lonely Mountain to reinforce their human allies. And we can see here that it's going to be Rhun attacking from this direction. Diego Rio Ramos heading up this army with some standard Eastron clansmen, which as far as a regular unit of infantry like this goes, they are pretty decent for what they are. Though of course if you send them up against especially high-end dwarven units, what they're actually going to achieve is going to be somewhat limited. But it's going to be a numbers game this, as it very often is in siege battles where the attackers have army advantages. Eastron warriors are in there as well, and they're going to be a little bit better in melee terms, though they do lack the shield, which means, especially with factions like Dale, who have got plentiful archers, this is exactly the kind of unit. While they may be weak, they're so easy to kill from range that it is actually worthwhile going after a unit like this if they aren't embedded in a unit like they are here with the clansmen. Just in behind we've got some Balkoth tribesmen. Recently we've seen throwing projectiles used very effectively for attackers. It's one of those kinds of units which you really can't afford to let run roughshod all over your defensive lines if you are at all able to stop them. And the Balkoth tribesmen represent an awkward kind of unit because they're not super expensive, so Rhun can utilise them a little bit more freely. This is a custom scenario, it's worth saying, so of course Rhun don't actually have to worry about building an army with their money. They just have to make do with what they have. Eastron hunters, so if it does come down to it, Rhun can engage in a little bit of skirmishing with the defensive forces, but obviously Dale will feel pretty comfortable in that regard, and the dwarves have got thick enough armour to the point where basic archers like this are going to be less of a concern. We saw very recently in the nighttime battle of Tol Falas, very cheap archers used to good effect against Rhun. We'll see if Rhun on this occasion can do the same in reverse. More Eastron warriors here, so again they'll be good in melee but maybe a little bit more exposed. This is a relatively low end army this, with some Eastron guard just in behind as well. Again, like probably one of the weirdest kind of infantry units in the game mechanically speaking, because their main selling point is the fact they're spears, so they have an anti-cavalry bonus, but yeah, weird kind of unit. You very often only see them in custom scenarios like this because generally speaking there are other units in Rhun's roster which are far more efficient. Speaking of which, we have the Flag Rim back here, and this is exactly the kind of unit that I'm talking about. They'll be good against Dale, but they will of course especially be efficient against the dwarves of Erebor, that heavy armour that they wear. Dwarves of course very well known for that, and the Easterlings come packed with plenty of armour piercing options under normal circumstances, though this army is a little bit more bare bones than the ones we're used to perhaps. And the general actually is going to be in a unit of Scion Rim on this occasion, which is a fairly decent place to put the general considering the kind of units that Diego has to work with. The Scion Rim definitely the toughest unit that Rhun have at their disposal today. Moving along to what was Rhun's opponent in the very last battle that we showed on the night battle at Tolflast. But on this occasion, normality has been restored, Khand once again falling back in step with the forces of evil. Variag warriors on that occasion were very useful, and while the higher armour values of the dwarves will make this kind of unit a little bit more difficult to use, they will actually be very good against the rank and file units from Dale, if they can get involved in melee without getting shot up first. Brotherhood of the Sword are here as well, a very good unit for their melee defense values. They don't have armor piercing though, which is going to be maybe a little bit more of a concern if they're wanting to go toe to toe with some of the better units that both Dale and the dwarves have at their disposal. However, the Nurad Stormguard do offer Khand a very high-end infantry unit which can at least face up to the best of what the dwarves have to offer. They may not win outright, but it's not every faction that can say they have a unit that's even capable of doing that. So the Nurad Stormguard are here, and they're a very dangerous kind of unit, exactly the sort of thing which I'm sure the defending projectiles will be hoping to home in on. Got some more Variag warriors over there. This is another very dangerous unit though for the defenders to take note of. The Brotherhood of the Axe, of course, that armor piercing could very well prove to be their undoing if it is utilised at the right time. But once again, even more vulnerable than the Stormguard to projectiles because of their lack of a second hit point. Heavier archers as well, nomadic infantry. This is the kind of unit which could really prove to be a bit of a problem for the defenders. We already mentioned the Eastron hunters, but they're so low tier that the defenders will fancy their chances at holding them at bay. But the nomadic infantry are bulky enough to go toe to toe with even something like the Bardian marksman from Dale. Dale should still have a slight edge if it does come down to it, especially with the terrain, but Khand can definitely contest this theatre of war perhaps better than certainly Dale would like. The Variag bowmen not quite as tanky as the nomadic infantry we just saw, but in many ways even more efficient. There are more of them after all. Generally speaking, they're cheaper as well, but of course in a custom scenario, worth bearing in mind once again that that kind of consideration kind of goes out the window. Nurad halberds and Nurad footmen, so more of a standard classic Khandish army this that you would expect to see. Plenty of Nurads, the classic front line of the footmen and the halberds, and then heavy archers backed up by a few units of quality, including the mighty Stormguard. So Khand, on this side of things under Joran's command, are more dangerous than their runic support, but we'll see how that plays out. And Variag horse archers in support as well, so I don't know how much of the outer reaches of the settlement will actually be used, but it does give them a bit more mobility to utilise for circling around the settlement, I suppose. Tuck the Gamer, who is over here at the base of the cliffs, already firing, although I think that's because it's on fire at will. Once again, we've got more of these Eastron Guard. They will struggle a little bit, I think, but all about numbers perhaps for Rhun, at least initially, and the attackers will of course be hoping that they can really leverage that, as we saw in the last battle. Fully upgraded Eastron Clansmen as well, so they're going to be up to a little bit more in melee. They're going to be able to withstand more punishment from the inevitable arrows that are going to be coming their way, and all those sorts of things do add up over the long run. It does make life more difficult for the defenders. A couple of units of Eastron Hunters, we've already spoken about them. Much more dangerous, however, are the Carmel's Shadow Bows, and considering this version of Dale does have a few more open aspects to it, if they set up in the wrong place and allow those body-piercing projectiles to start ripping through blocks of infantry, that's going to really reflect quite poorly on the defenders, and it's the sort of thing that you can't really recover from given the kind of odds they're already facing. So we'll see if the defenders are ready and able to repel those rangers. More Eastron warriors, already mentioned them of course, and their weaknesses. The strengths of the Balkoth tribesmen as well, and finally another general and another unit of Scion Rim. Looking like another runic army over here as well. Ankles, that's an interesting name. He has got some Gamp Rim, which is going to be useful. We haven't really seen too much other than the Nurad halberds on the other side in terms of anchoring units for the attackers, and this is going to be important, especially armor-piercing halberdiers like this. Exactly the sort of thing which can help them punch up to the dwarves, I suppose, ironically enough. In quality terms, of course, not height. But yeah, Gamp Rim, nice anchor. We've got more of the Eastron Guard, yet more of the Eastron Guard. We have a little bit more of an elite army this from Ankles, it looks like. Eastron Warriors, Scion Rim are over in the distance, but this is the first runic army we've seen that includes the Carmel's Chosen, the bodyguard infantry that Rhun can bring, although once again, the general is actually in the Scion Rim, so the Carmel's Chosen can be used a little bit more freely. And last, but by no means least, we have another Khandish force under the command of Hammer. He's got some nomadic units over here, so nomadic warriors, very basic as far as this kind of unit goes, kind of similar to the Eastron Clansmen we've already seen, but as we've often seen in siege battles like this, quantity is a quality all of its own, and the attackers will need to lean on that at least a little bit, given the kind of forces they're inevitably going to be facing off against. Armour upgraded Variag warriors as well, just give them a little bit more staying power both at range and in melee, which is always going to be useful. We've got some upgraded Variag bowmen as well, which is going to make them better at what they do, which generally speaking is skirmishing with opposition archers. I've already mentioned how powerful the Storm Guard are, more warriors, got some basic nomadic raiders, kind of the equivalent to the Eastron hunters we saw from Rhun throughout the battlefield as well. More Variag warriors, quite a lot of nomadic axemen as well, which are a lower end unit, but they still have armour piercing, which is going to be useful for all the reasons we've already mentioned. A couple of units of nomadic marauders with those javelins, kind of similar to the Balcloth tribesmen, though a little bit more of a rabble. And then a couple of cavalry units as well, including the Glory Seekers, which are a very weird kind of concept in the game. They're like a fodder cavalry unit. I will be interested to see how this unit is utilised when the cavalry overhauls come in for the next patch, because at the moment, of course, it doesn't really matter. Single HP cavalry like this is very rarely useful, but the Glory Seekers, in a weird kind of way, can be, because they're intended to die. And then we have the nomadic light cavalry as well, so another unit of lower end horse archers, but again, a little bit more mobility perhaps as well. So then, we now move on to the defenders, starting off with the Dwarves of Erebor, who are going to be under the command of the Flame of Arnor, player who gave me this replay and I believe also made the scenario as well. So a small dwarven force this, but we'll see how they do. Obsidian Guard, of course, have got that dual wielding, which is going to make them very tough to break down with the classic dwarven armour that they have, and also the very high melee defense values that comes from being a dual wielding unit. Very, very tough to break down in prolonged melee. Armour piercing projectiles are really your best bet. Ironfoot warriors are here as well with the armour upgrade. They're a very solid unit of line infantry, but basic, considering the size of the dwarven army overall. They're going to be in more of a supporting role here, the dwarves, and the Ironfoot warriors are definitely going to need to pull their weight pretty significantly. Of course, the dwarven miners, the closest thing dwarves have to a fodder unit. I suppose as far as a militia combatant goes, the armour piercing is useful. Rhun and Cand do have armoured units, and they do lean on those armour values a little bit. Ironfoot axe throwers, it may only be one unit, but axe throwers are exactly the sort of thing which can start breaking up those halberdier blocks as they start pushing towards the settlement. And then back here, looking like another fairly dense force this from the dwarves. Ironfoot pikes, Axe Guard of Erebor in there as well, another unit of the Obsidian Guard, which is an interesting choice. Highborns of Erebor also, so plenty of pikes and some armour piercing in there, as well as some bodyguard tier stuff. So Erebor do have quality, but it's not overwhelming quality, which can often be the temptation, I think, for people making scenarios. So I'm glad the Flame of Arnor exercised a bit of restraint with the dwarven armies, given the quality they can have. Farkin is playing as one of the Dalian defenders. Dalian spearmen will make a decent line holding unit. The damage is going to have to be dealt elsewhere, but they can definitely act as the shield. Just in behind we have some Lake Town pikemen, and actually will be very useful as well, because they will outrange the halberdiers that the attackers are going to be reliant upon. And then we also have those dismounted earls in there as well to help solidify the line. Bardian marksmen, we've already mentioned Dale when we were talking about the attackers being able to skirmish with the best of them, and Bardian marksmen are going to have to be doing at least a little bit of that. And dominating the long-range battle is how Dale are going to have to try and approach this battle, because if they allow the attackers to bully them in that regard, then they're onto a losing thing, I think. A few units of Swordmasters of Escaroth, they will be able to outperform stuff like the Variag Warriors, and they will also be very good at dealing with the lower-end units, especially from Rhun, that we've seen throughout the battlefield as well. We've got some Dalian Bowmen, not quite as good as the Bardian Marksmen, but they will do much the same sort of job. With that armour upgrade as well, they will just be that little bit more solid than they would otherwise be. Another unit of them there, Dalian Spearmen. We also have the Barding Herd, which as far as the Halberdier unit goes, I do rate them above the Nurad Halberds and the Gamprim. They've just got that thicker armour, they're a little bit more resilient, but they will do much the same sort of job, and support is going to be vital for these Dalian front lines. As we make our way over towards the southern edge of the settlement, we have Lord Skitsfire, who is the third and final defender, more Dalian Spearmen and more Barding Herd. Archers already in a good position with Dalian Bowmen and Bardian Marksmen ready to rain down some arrow fire on the approaching Eastlings. More Swordmasters over here, the mighty Dalian Paladins, which they of course with their solid armour piercing damage values are going to be very, very useful at taking on the units in the late game. Swordmaster of Esgaroth, Morbardian Marksman, some Dalian Royal Guard as well, which is where one of the Dalian generals finds himself. And there's some more dismounted Earls over here. Lake Town Pikemen and dismounted Earls once more guarding one of the river crossings. And finally over here we actually have our first example of Lake Town infantry, and also some more Dalian Royal Guard over here. So no Dragon Slayers by the looks of things. Won't be able to rely on that damage spike from those armour-piercing missiles, but I imagine we're not going to have to wait too long here, given the arrows are already starting to fly. So without further ado, let's get this show on the road, shall we? I have to say, the angle being what it is, I probably wouldn't recommend loosing too many volleys from down here if I were Rhun. This, of course, not a Battle of the Five Armies type situation. This is of the events of the War of the Ring, clearly, with the evil men marching upon Dale and the dwarves of Erebor coming out to support their allies on a much better footing with one another at this point in time. Of course, the Bardings and the dwarves, Dalian Royal Guard, also in a good position. There's no real escaping the fact that they're going to have to take range damage as they push forward here, Rhun, because of the positioning of these archers, which is something else the defenders can really take advantage of. One thing that can always be a little bit of a frustration for defenders is when the attackers simply don't allow them to utilise their ranged units in an appropriate manner, but when the map itself makes it very difficult for the attackers to do that. It's definitely the sort of thing which can work in their favour. Joran pushing forward with his Candish army, one of the more dangerous armies on the field for the reasons that we've already stated. And the dwarves are also arriving in through the northern entrance to the settlement. And the Norad footmen will get right down to business, so there really is no grace period at all, which is heartening to see. The Norad footmen colliding with the Dalian spearmen there. And I don't know whether Diego's army is also going to be... Well, they are actually moving forward fairly quickly, and it's also maybe a little bit of an indictment here on Lord Skitsfire's army that he has allowed the Keldon River Patrol to be caught out in melee when he has this kind of choke point to try and block Rhun's progress with. The Eastron Warriors will probably end up routing as a result of this, but this is still the right thing for Diego to do. Finding gaps and then trying to consolidate your gains in those gaps are exactly the sort of thing which can make this sort of choke point very, very difficult to hold on to in the long term for the defenders. And given the positions of the archers up on the hill over there, which at the moment are still not firing, but this is far too good of a position to give up. And of course, if one of the outer choke points falls, it makes life very, very difficult for the defenders in holding on to the first layer in general. And any sort of shoddy retreat to the second layer will also work in the attacker's favour. So we'll see if that proves to be the case here. Dalian Spearmen and Bardingherd doing a decent job at holding on with more spearmen as well. More of a panic push forward than anything else. The Keldon River Patrol are not going to fall entirely in the face of the Eastron Warriors anyway. And with some lumbermen coming in, this is a situation that can be salvaged. And now, will Diego want to push forward more units? I don't know, it probably is going to be worthwhile, I would say. And another push across this river as well. So both sides of Dale coming under pretty significant pressure now. Some Nar Rim firing across the river, and they've got a fairly decent angle as well. The Earls and the Dalian Spearmen are going to be fairly resilient to that sort of pressure. Those are the clear projectiles of Athala Rangers, and the angle is pretty good for them as well. The Glory Seekers moving in. The massive cavalry, this is the sort of thing which the AI tends to do actually in campaign. Slam cavalry against a well-prepared front line, but it can actually work in this kind of situation. It can allow your infantry to push forward with a little bit more gusto. And that's really the only thing the Glory Seekers are going to be good for in this battle anyway, but it is maybe a little early to be using them for that purpose just yet. Maybe waiting for Dale to be a little bit more depleted before attempting such things would be for the best. Once again, we're seeing some Carnal Shadow Guard involved in the front line as well, though, offering significantly more bite than many of the other runic units, but still it's going to be those Athala Rangers which are going to be doing a huge amount of the damage thus far. Back over to here, you can see that the dwarves are now also getting involved, coming to the aid of Dale on this front line against the Candish host. Still Dalian bowmen out there as well. Cand continuing to push forward reinforcements with the dwarves over here, and with Dale pretty well prepared in terms of their infantry strength as well. I don't think Joran is going to be smashing his way through this front line anytime soon. Swordmaster of Escaroth in the background as well. Murads continuing to push forward. The Stormguard, it would be fairly early to commit the Stormguard. And the Brotherhood of the Axe as well. I mean, it would be a bit of a marker, but surely it's the sort of thing as well which would attract all sorts of attention from archers, although over here there isn't really as easy or clear of a shot from the high ground that they can use as on the other two choke points which are currently being pressurised. Diego has continued to push forward with more units. The Keldrin River Patrol have been salvaged and now throwing their javelins in. You can see over here once again they have pushed through and found a gap, but as with the last time, I don't think Rhun are going to be able to make this stick because I just don't think they have the quality over here, and especially not now that Dale are also utilising their archers from on high. So initially there from Lord Skitsfire it was looking a little bit dodgy, but he has recovered and now very much in the ascendancy over here, and it's a fairly comfortable engagement for them. You can still see back there Variag mercenaries, Carmel shadowbows and Eastron hunters, so lots of damage being poured in from the attacking skirmishers as well. Stuff like the lumbermen will fall away very, very quickly as a result of that kind of pressure. So far, so good. River Patrol trying to get a little bit closer to use their javelins once more. So over here, that was an artillery piece. Indeed, there it is. Catapult hitting centre mass there. And Joran thinking twice about having the Stormguard in here if catapults are going to be firing their payloads in. Brotherhood of the Sword are on the front line with plenty more Neurads. You can see there is a little bit more pressure coming Dale's way now. They might need just more than the one unit of Ironfoot warriors from the dwarves helping them out. The axe throwers, though, will be more than happy to oblige in that regard. You can see, though, the Neurad footmen are starting to push through, and River Patrol are the ones that are trying to block further access, and Dalian bowmen. So out of ammunition, skirmishers being utilised now as a blocker unit. And especially against stuff like Brotherhood of the Sword, the River Patrol are going to get absolutely demolished. Dalian bowmen, victory is almost a certainty, so a couple of units did manage to get back here into the back line, so it is a sign that the attackers are actively looking on these choke points to find little gaps and prise the defensive lines apart to make their passage just that little bit smoother. So a good idea. Axe throwers leaving the area. There's not a huge amount of reserves left for canned, so they're going to have to start making some real progress now. Over on this side, however, this is where the attackers are going to have a lot more left in the tank, whereas on the other side, both armies, there's only one per choke point. Over here, there's technically 3 for a single one, although they can, of course, take the long path around and try and go further north, although there is that clutch of dwarven units over there also, so it's not quite so easy. But the attackers can afford to be a little, well, they're simply going to have more in reserve over here. They're going to be able to sustain their assault over on this side for far longer than on the other, which is a sign maybe that on the other side they should maybe have been a little bit more cautious, but considering the gaps they perceived at the start of the game, it was maybe worth the risk of trying to get in there and put the defenders firmly on the back foot from the start. But the defenders, despite some inconsistencies in their defence, have managed to weather that storm. Some more dwarven units on the front line. I mean, you can see the fact that Carmel's Chosen are on the front line, and there's plenty of arrow support coming in from Rhun as well. You can see that this is a fairly efficient engagement from the attackers over on this side. Sending forward, looks like some flag rim as well, so yeah, they don't have a limitless supply of this kind of unit in this battle, Rhun, but they clearly sense the fact that this could work out quite nicely for them, and some units are managing to get in and around. And as soon as they get on this side of the river, they can establish themselves and start trying to push further in. You can see, in fact, now that, as was the case in the actual battle as well, some of the Dalian units are perhaps preparing to move back to the gates of Erebor, escape northwards. And indeed they are running a little bit low on time to salvage more units from that particular front line. Some of the Dalians still maintaining their position at the summit of the settlement. let's not forget this was basically a Pyrrhic victory for the defenders in the actual events of the War of the Ring. It cost King Brand and King Dane their lives, and Dale itself, of course, was initially taken by the Easterling host, but not for too long, when they were eventually forced back after news of Sauron's defeat spread. More Candish units, and you can see here that the out of ammo skirmishers are starting to struggle a little bit more on this front line as well. River Patrol are going to get in the way of more of these halberdiers, but those Nurad footmen can continue to move around as well. A little bit of a different matter when it's the Dalian Royal Guard that are the out of ammo archers that are being used there. Javelins, exactly the sort of thing which have probably been doing a fair amount of the damage here to the Brotherhood of the Sword. There's also some Brotherhood of the Axe in there as well, so as much as can have ultimately, well, will have victory over here, it has cost Joran quite a lot of his strength. And I would imagine that it's going to be a fairly similar story over here, if indeed Diego is going to be victorious at all. I mean, he is, with the retreating units, he will be victorious. Probably has a little bit more left in the tank actually than Joran, but of course his units, generally speaking, are of lower quality, so I don't think that's going to prove to be too much of a problem. Eastron warriors surging forwards. The Flag Rim and the Scion Rim will also follow through. Some Carmel's units here and there as well. So what are they going to do? It does look as though they are going to try and empty Dale. They're not going to try and hold on to the positions at the top of the hill. I mean, stuff like the artillery is going to have to be left behind. There's no way they're going to be able to get that out of there. And as much as this is what happened narratively, I don't know if it's going to result in the easiest battle for the defenders to come back from, because naturally if you were playing this battle how you wanted to, you would probably want to utilise the higher level of Dale itself before anything else. Going after the Brotherhood of the Shadows, Swordmaster of Esgaroth able to finish off this small amount of Nurad footmen. Some of those horse archers up on that hill firing down in there. Still, stuff like the River Patrol throwing themselves in the way. Naturally, Nurad Stormguard are going to easily be able to defeat the kind of units that have been sent against them here. The armour upgrade will certainly not be enough to save the Dalian Bowmen from their fate here. And now also with some Easterlings cresting the hill in support of the nomads of the Far East. More units moving forward, but you can see that Joran's army is a little bit thin on the ground, as we've already mentioned. But it's over here now that we may have the problem. Tuck the Gamer has managed to push forwards and around this defensive position, which means there is going to be no retreat from Dale. At least no more of the units from Dale are going to be able to get out easily, because there are now runic units actively in the way. Oof, that is pretty brutal though. Some point blank hits from the catapult. That's exactly the sort of thing they're going to need to see a little bit more of. I think ultimately their fate will be sealed over here, but if they can damage the enemy army in ways that are not dissimilar from that, then the dwarves, which are already starting to try and retreat up the hill to the tower, their quality could be enough to see the defenders over the line. Again though, when a fight gets messy like this, you're always thinking that it's going to favour the attackers just that little bit more, although these units that did manage to stand in the way are now starting to rout. Eastron clansmen, no match for stuff like Dalian paladins and swordmasters of Esgaroth. Continuing to move forwards. Cand and Rhun finishing off what remains of the rear guard over here. Just a few Dalian spearmen remain. Eastron hunters, not the sort of thing they'll mind facing off against though. A couple of units of lumbermen standing in the way of the catapult, and they will need to continue to do that. The catapult will still have a little bit of ammunition after all. We've already mentioned how important that could be moving further on into this fight. Although the angle's starting to be against them a little bit, most of the ammunition thudding into the building in front of them. Guardian marksmen pulling back a little bit further. Nurad Stormguard, the shape of the engagement is certainly not on their side, and as a result the general actually does fall. They should still win that fight, but Putting your general in harm's way like that always carries its risks. Lumberman once again blocking the Shadow Guard. That seems to be an awful lot of what the defenders are doing at this point, blocking some of the stronger aspects of the attacking armies from going where they really want to quickly enough, and these delays are all well and good as long as it's building towards something for the defenders. And as much as some small pockets of the engagement, stuff like the Dalian Paladins here, are going to be doing very well in this kind of fight, overall, this is surely the sort of thing which is going to favour the attackers in the long run. Lake Town Infantry, I mean, they are intended to be a melee combatant once out of ammunition, but against this kind of foe, they aren't going to have what it takes. Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen and Belkoth Sapphire Bladesmen in place to throwing projectile units. There's more Guildsmen over there as well, so assassin class units, catapult firing away in the background as well. Some of the Dalian units, by the looks of the minimap, did manage to escape the settlement, though not all that many, I would suggest. The catapult now, surely, is going to get interrupted. There are still Dalians at the summit of the settlement here. More units, more reinforcements from the other Candish army from Hammer now starting to make their appearance as well. Worrying times for the defenders when there is yet more pressure on the way. More arrow fire. Those Dalian bowmen and Bardian marksmen, still some dismounted earls as well. I mean, to be fair, those Dalian Royal Guard are going to be strong, but unfortunately for them they do find themselves facing off against the Storm Guard. So they're going to need the support of their archers in behind if they are to have much success here. And the Shadow Guard taking hits from those fire arrows as well. I mean, trying to rout them, but I doubt you're going to be able to do that, and certainly the Nurad Storm Guard are not going to be going anywhere with the engagement going the way that it is. Nomadic Marauders surging forwards as well. Not too much left of Dale over here, the Dalian Paladins fighting away. A bit of the Shadows still have ammunition by the looks of it. Everything else, I mean, I'm a little bit surprised that some of these units from Diego are not moving up and around to surround and finish off what remains up here, albeit this is pretty much all there is. And the only thing that's going to be gaining much value for Dale at this stage is going to be the 2 units of archers they've still got plugging away. Eastron Hunters do push through. This is something that the attackers have been really good at. They have been really good at force pathing their units through, and they've done it with units of the lowest quality and units of the highest quality. They've been really willing to find those gaps, push through and try and interrupt the supporting units, and we've already mentioned how important that is to a faction like Dale, that their firing lines continue throughout the course of their ammunition supply, and that has not been something they've been allowed to do so far. And you have to say fair play. Dismounted Earls broken and fighting to the death, 41 of them still remain, but overwhelming force being applied to the situation. I suppose there is nothing more to be done over here. Rhun already preparing to move after the final resistance within Dale itself has been extinguished. Getting ready to move forwards. The burning buildings, of course, that was entirely at the hands of the defenders themselves in attempting to utilise their catapult, which for a few volleys was very effective. They needed maybe a little bit more of that, though, I think, in order for it to be truly worth its weight. Based on the restrictions placed on the defenders, there's only so much they were going to be able to do here, but I do think that, as I've already mentioned, the attackers do deserve credit for finding those gaps, such as this one here, with Nomadic Raiders now joining the Eastron Hunters at the top of the hill as well. But the defenders really shouldn't be allowing this sort of thing to happen. In this set case is obviously too late now, and there are going to be gaps no matter what you do, but from the earlier points in the battle where there was really no need for it to be happening, that's where I would suggest improvements could be made. Defeat is a distinct possibility. You don't say. Yeah, you can already see Rhun starting to trudge forwards. We'll go and take a look at where the defenders have decided to post up in just a moment. I have to say though, they're not actually sending up anything of truly high quality yet to deal with the Dalian Bowmen and the Bardian Marksmen, so they are actually continuing to defeat these low-end skirmishers that are being fed to them. Any kills that they get from here have to be viewed as a bit of a bonus, I suppose. One of the defending generals also falls, so one of the Dalian generals. One of the Candish generals also falling, that's one apiece that have died in the settlement itself. The rest will meet their fate on the hillside. I mean, this is what the Bardian Marksmen are supposed to be fairly decent at doing. They can double as a fairly decent, more defensively minded infantry unit though, so the amount of damage they're actually going to be able to do is probably fairly limited, and also the nomadic infantry are a very, very similar kind of unit that can have in their roster. And also with stuff like Flagrim arriving as well. Still only shaken though are the bowman. Defeat almost a certainty, 56 and 46, so there's, I mean, just shy of 100 men guarding this hill. I do think that the attackers have been trying to get away with committing as little as possible to that particular fight while still trying to overwhelm them, which is fair enough, but I feel like in this sort of situation you can just as easily completely overwhelm them, and that tends to be the best way to go about your business. Yeah, with Flagrim on the front line, that should be the beginning of the end for these units. These Dalian Bowmen, interestingly enough, not having the armour upgrade. Some of the, both for the attackers and the defenders, where the armour upgrades are and are not, seems to be a little bit sporadic. There's a few Camel's Shadow Guard in there as well, only 17 of them. In this kind of situation though, where missiles are flying back and forth when you're taking a settlement, stuff like the Shadow Guard are effective in melee for that damage spike they offer you, but their vulnerability to projectiles is always going to rear its ugly head. And the Bardian Marksmen are wavering as the Dalian Bowmen are now fighting to the death, which means they're not going to be effective in melee at all, they'll just be standing in the way basically. I have to say, I much prefer the armour upgraded version of the Bardian Marksmen to the standard one, but in practical terms, melee wise, they're not going to get too much stronger as a result of that anyway. It's more of an extra accent on their strength at range. Flagrim, victory seems certain for them. Defeat is a distinct possibility. I'm surprised actually that they have, well now they have routed. As if by magic, it's like they heard me. So that is going to be it. It's been a bit of a trudging affair, but they have managed to do the business in the end. And there is a pathway across, so they have managed to set themselves up in position over here. And actually the fight has begun over here, so I'm actually quite glad we don't have a transitional phase to worry about. Brotherhood of Shadows, Brotherhood of the Shadows I should say. So they're going to have to be leaning fairly heavily, I think, on dwarven quality if they are to go on to be victorious in this particular fight. I mean, they do have some Athala Rangers still. I don't know how much ammunition they still have. We've already seen them used a little bit in the settlement, and as we can already see, still a fairly high amount of attacking forces left to be committed. Not an insurmountable one if they can use stuff like rangers and specialty projectiles to their fullest, but certainly from the first phase of the battle, you would be feeling pretty good if you were the attackers, enforced by the narrative or no. And this is the kind of unit which could also be fairly decisive as well. Ironfoot Pikes. Neither Rhun nor Cand have got access to a pike unit of their own, and the Ironfoot Pikes are reasonably solid as well. Decent armour values, a good anchor to a line. Exactly the sort of thing which can cause problems if you've got no projectiles of your own to try and break up those lines with, although I think with Rhun having access to the Sapphire Bladesman and the standard Balkoth Tribesmen, I think they should have the tools to deal with that sort of dwarven defence, provided they haven't dumped all their ammunition early. And I think that's what they're trying to do here, the Balkoth Tribesmen. Going to try and set up as close as they possibly can and maybe get some point-blank throws into the dwarven line. Some of the Bardian marksmen that were salvaged being utilised. Actually, they're just being used as standard infantry. They won't be too effective, but they are at least into the sides of those pikes now, and the shadow bows being used in much the same vein, having used up their ammunition already in the victory in the settlement. Trying to surround, but all this does is encourage the dwarves to move forward, and that'll be the end of the shadow bows pretty quickly, especially with the Axe Guard of Erebor in and amongst that clutch of units. Pikes. They've still got the Highborns. I think they've still got 2 units of the Obsidian Guard as well, so individual quality certainly on their side, and they can retreat all the way to the tower as well should they decide it necessary. So they do have a little bit further they can retreat to on both sides of this little crossroads. And blackened projectiles, so that's another unit of the Dalian Royal Guard. That's from Lord Skitsfire, so Farkin's General, the one that perished in Dale itself. Would come the Eastron Clansmen, so what was a fairly chaotic and brutal fight for the settlement has now morphed. The second phase of this battle is going to be a much more structured one, and it's going to be the attackers trying to break the defenders down as they dig in on this hillside. And they are still trying to shape the engagement to be a little bit less painful for them, so again that's something that the attackers deserve credit for once more, but having to do so against dwarven infantry with stuff like Eastron Clansmen is going to help, but it's by no means going to be decisive. When you look at this front line as well, Obsidian Guard at the centre of a bunch of Ironfoot spears and pikes. Javelins are being used. Sapphire Bladesmen and Nomadic Marauders throwing their javelins in, and if those javelins continue to connect, I do think that'll be the difference maker, and I do think that'll be what causes an attacking victory. Because they simply won't be able to sustain those levels of casualties considering the damage they've already taken, the defenders, so very much worth bearing that in mind as the battle goes on, although the dwarves actually being pretty aggressive here, testing the mettle of the attacking infantry that have been sent forward to engage with them, and stuff like the Variag mercenaries are not doing so well in this kind of fight. The Nurad Storm Guard are moving forwards. That's exactly the sort of thing which will give the dwarves pause. I mean, this is interesting. It could backfire on the Flame of Arnor, but I suspect he feels as though he doesn't have too much choice, given the pressure that all of these throwing projectiles are putting them under. Nomadic Marauders, Sapphire Bladesmen, and Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen all here doing the business. I mean, even if they do push through, though, the problem that the dwarves will probably have is the fact that the Sapphire Bladesmen, as we've seen very recently, are actually a very accomplished melee combatant as well, and standard Ironfoot units are actually going to lose one-to-one with them, so it's all well and good getting into melee with them, but being victorious in that kind of fight is another matter entirely. Shadow Guard pushing forward still. Victory seems certain, only a fool could lose this battle. And now, having pushed through, that does leave the back lines a little bit more exposed, considering the fact that they've left the Scion Rim behind, which is not the easiest unit to get rid of. They do have some out of ammunition bowmen there. The Ironfoot axe throwers are getting into place. If they can start throwing their payload, that's the sort of thing which could deal a decent damage spike to the attackers, but Again, Sapphire Bladesman being forced into melee, Storm Guard. There's a few Cummels chosen still alive, though not that many, given their exertions in the settlement earlier. And yeah, I mean, it was a bold move from the Dwarves, but I don't necessarily think it's going to pay off. This is the unit that needs to really start doing the business, though, the Athala Rangers. If they can continue to fire in there, could end up being pretty nasty for them. The Obsidian Guard coming in, that should be enough to finish off this straggler unit of Scion Rim that got in behind the lines as a result of the Dwarven push down the hill. Next Guard of Erebor trying to do their thing. A few guildsmen there. 30 Nirad Storm Guards still alive, and that is Joran's unit, so they've seen an awful lot of combat in this battle, and they're still healthy enough to be very, very useful indeed. Seeing a few throwing axes there, not the entire unit deploying their ammunition all at once, but added to the Athala Rangers, that is a decent damage spike, and something worth bearing in mind here is the fact that reinforcements are a little bit far away. Hammer's army still largely unused, actually, so it's going to be pretty much one Candish force at full strength that's going to try and smash the defensive effort apart in the late game. There went another general, this time a runic one. Yeah, stuff like Variag warriors, nomadic warriors, still a few units from Diego as well. It's not as if Hammer has committed nothing up the hill so far, but they do have plenty of reinforcements, you can see in their blocks down there. But a little bit far away. And progress, forward momentum up the hill has stalled. The fact that the Dwarves have actually forced them back down the hill is heartening for them, although it has come at a cost, as we've already mentioned. Good hits there from the throwing projectiles right into the Ironfoot pikes, as we've already mentioned, more of that. And the odds are ever more against the defenders. More arrows. Units that are still in reserve, out of ammo skirmishers. There's a few high-end bodyguard tier units from the Dwarves as well. Even the Daily and Raw Guard are a very strong unit to have in the back pocket for the late game. They weren't really able to thrive in the settlement because they were immediately mobbed by an overwhelming force, including Storm Guard, so their quality was never going to be enough. But in this situation, alongside the Dwarves, in a well dug in position like this, things might be different. Axe Guard of Erebor, once again the Dwarves trying to burrow their way through the lines. The Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen getting shot up pretty badly by the Royal Guard, and Bardian Marksmen also getting involved. The odd throwing axe whizzing past as well. Large amounts of the nomadic warriors. Still those Nirad Storm Guard, they're now in behind the lines actually. Once again they've been sort of left behind as the Dwarves try to force their way forwards. It's an interesting sort of aggressive stance that Erebor have taken, and so far it's kind of worked, but I just don't know whether they've got the manpower to sustain that sort of thing. But I think the Storm Guard have got enough necessarily anymore to actually be able to defeat this unit of Dalian bowmen that have been sent forward. Maybe. If the entire unit of bowmen engages all at once, certainly not, but if they continue to go one at a time like that, it's the sort of engagement which may start to get away from the bowmen. Another volley from the Athala Rangers, ripping through a decent blob of units, although to be fair, most of them at this point are nomadic warriors, not the highest quality by any means. There's a few Variag warriors in there as well. Again, as they continue to push forward though, they're leaving behind these units on the flank, and actually on this occasion it's the most dangerous units they're leaving behind as well, with Nirad Storm Guard in behind the lines, Sapphire Bladesmen and Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen now. It's the sort of thing where if they go too far here, Erebor's morale could start to be called into question. It's certainly stronger on average than Can's, as you can see from the nomadic warriors fleeing at the sight of the Obsidian Guard and their underlings continuing to push forward, but it really is a dangerous game for Erebor to be playing, because if it does backfire, that's pretty much game, set and match. But having said that, I suppose they have to do something, given the way that the first phase of the battle went, taking a few risks to try and get yourself back into genuine contention is not the worst move that can be made. This, however, is where the attackers will be feeling pretty good. Guildsmen and Sapphire Bladesmen, although again they have recognised the danger that they represent, the Highborns of Erebor now being sent in to try and deal with these stragglers, along with a little bit of support coming in from both Dale and some of these standard Ironfoot units. So far, you can see here the structure has already presented itself. The Obsidian Guard up front, the Ironfoot Pikes in particular, probably the most important supporting unit they have. It's making life very difficult for the attackers here. They've tried to use their throwing projectiles and they've been successful to a point, but maybe not in the volume that they would have been wanting. Now the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen trying to go back down the hill. A second unit of Storm Guard, this one from Hammer. We saw how long Jorans have lasted for. They are now being brought down, but they've been involved pretty much from the first moments of the battle, and they're only now being killed off completely, so a second unit of Storm Guard is not the sort of thing the defenders will be too pleased to see. Usually this layout of defence, where there's enemy attacking units in behind your primary front line and it's all a little bit messy, tends to favour the attackers, but I do think the Dwarven quality is really helping them here. And the attackers do have a bit of a conundrum because they need to send forward probably overwhelming force, I would say, but on a path as narrow as this, with dangers like the Athala Rangers still waiting further on. I don't know how much ammunition the Rangers necessarily have left. They've been firing away throughout this battle at this point, not dumping all their ammunition all at once, but they must be running their supply pretty close at this stage. More Flagrim and Gamprim moving forward will certainly help matters. Daly and Bowman moving a little bit further back. The stragglers are being killed off now, the Obsidian Guard and the Highborns of Erebor doing their thing. With another wave of Golden Boys now on the front line. You can start to see the Dwarven front line is looking a little bit thinner. They may need those bodyguard tier units to help them hold on, but with the amount of halberdiers now arriving, is that going to be wise? Only half the Dwarven army remains. I mean, that's not a bad return. There's a lot of Flagrim and Scion Rim now moving forward from ankles as well. That's where the runic bodyguards are. Pray something changes. Yeah, I mean, I guess this is it. This is the decisive moment, isn't it? Because if this doesn't work for the attackers, they don't really have much left. I mean, this is everything that they're sending forward now. I just don't know if the defenders have got enough to actually hold them at bay indefinitely. I'm going to assume not. I think the Athala Rangers are actually fighting something in melee. If they still had a volley or two, maybe that would be a bit of a difference maker. Doesn't look like they've got much in the way of pole arms left at Dwarves. The Ironfoot Pikes, we did mention earlier on how important hitting them with the throwing daggers and the javelins may be. And they were able to do that, the attackers, ultimately. Maybe not in an immediately devastating fashion, but still. There goes another runic general, though. Morale is something which may yet play its part. Though I think that may also be the case the other way round, of course, with it not being a traditional siege. There's no town centre at the top of the hill for the dwarves to retreat to. Not that that ends up being a decisive factor in most siege battles anyway. Is the dwarven quality going to be enough? There's still Highborns of Erebor in there. 60 of them. Obsidian Guard just shy of 60, 58. So I mean, individual units of quality in there, certainly, and the only thing the attackers really have on the same level, as already mentioned, is the Storm Guard. But Gamp Rim, armor piercing, good armor piercing. Plenty of numbers, still got some guildsmen. Siren, it's going to be very close, actually, this. And part of that is going to be, again, the Daily Royal Guard offering another high-quality unit that can be sent in. Even the Athala Rangers at this late stage, they don't have any ammunition left, but their melee defense will be enough to just slow the attackers. They'll be more difficult to kill in pure melee than perhaps you would expect. I mean, we are now within the final 10,000 frames. So this is going to be it. The slog to the end, essentially, because there's nothing else really to be committed. There's one unit of Bardian Marksmen still in the backfield for the defenders. Those Flag Rim are actually routing, which is a bad sign. If the attacker's morale starts to collapse, that would be most unfortunate, but I don't know, I think a lot of this is going to come down to how effective the attacking polearms can now be, I think. Because if it comes down to just a straight slog in terms of quality, the defenders will win. They've got 3 bodyguard tier units, and 2 of which are dwarven bodyguard tier units, so you know how resilient they're going to be. I have to say, however, the Gamp Rim have maybe not been as decisive in this particular battle as I thought they were going to be. In fact, what remains of them is actually routing. So now the Storm Guard are going to be the thing which has to really carry the day. You can see one of the runic generals in there. The Scion Rim trying to force their way to the front line and be a little bit more of a bulwark for this force, because too many of the more entry-level units are letting the side down a little bit, perhaps. I mean, on this kind of hillside, it's exactly the kind of defence which the dwarves love to put on, and we've seen exactly why. In spite of the early game certainly going the way of the attackers, this kind of battle as it went into the second phase more favoured the defenders, and they've been able to fight their way back to certainly parity and probably victory from here, I'm suggesting. The Storm Guard, it's gonna, if the attackers do win, it will be on the back of the Storm Guard, I think. The Storm Guard have got plenty more support after all than the bodyguard tier units of the defenders. When you consider the kind of units that are backing up the Royal Guard and the 2 dwarven bodyguards, it's pretty much all out of ammo skirmishers of varying levels of competence in melee, whereas for the attackers, the Storm Guard do have with them the Scion Rim. Variag Warriors are at least a dedicated melee unit. The Flag Rim have returned. So it's a lot of units for the defenders to still chop their way through. Bardians, still a unit of 92 which can be committed when the need arises. And we could end up with very, very fine margins indeed here. See how slowly the Storm Guard are perishing. With the Obsidian Guard, they've taken a lot more damage since the last time we saw them. What about the Highborns? 50? Not taking damage at perhaps quite the same rate as the Obsidian Guard. The Daily Royal Guard starting to fight their way to the front line now as well. There goes, I think that could have either been the Dalian General or the Candish one. Can we see his corpse on the floor? Not really. Can we see? Well, it's not the Dalian one because he's back there, so it must have been Hammer's general. Again, that sort of morale shot could be vital moving into the final stages here. It's a lot to hack their way through, though, as high quality as these units are. If these were all no, that's the Candish general. So yeah, it must have been the runic one then. Diego's general, but there's not much of Rhun left anyway. If this was all basic Candish units and the Storm Guard were not here, it would be an easy thing to say that the defenders should go on to win from here. They're fighting downhill, they've got quality. The attackers have been tiring, having to march their way up this hill. But with the Storm Guard there, it does muddy the waters significantly. It adds a good splash of quality to the numbers that they still have, but having said that, all of these units very tired and exhausted. A few of the Dalian ones actually still fresh, maybe not the ones that they would want them to be, but still. Every little aspect is going to be important here. Any little advantage they can claim, they will. And it could be enough to see them over the line. Defeat is almost a certainty for some of them. Dalian Royal Guard, there's still 57 Dalian Royal Guard. I mean, as a two-handed sword unit, they do have that good base damage, they do have a good melee defense as well. It's still not the easiest thing to take on those Nurad Storm Guards from the front, but they will do what they can, I'm sure. The announcer now changing his tune, which is very often a sign that you can back the defenders a little bit more readily. Sometimes the announcer gets a little bit confused, but for the most part, when a battle tilts from one direction to the other, it is a sign that the overall course is actually going the defenders' way. As they continue to push in. Some of the Storm Guard marooned up on the side here. Trying to use the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen. I mean, there's not many units they've been able to hit from down there. The sight lines, of course, being on a hill such as this. Something else the defenders have been able to rely upon. What do they have left? Variag Bowmen that are out of ammunition. A few Variag Warriors in there. That Flag Rim, which did rout once before, so as soon as they get into actual melee, I can't imagine they're going to stick around for too much longer. They probably will flee again in double quick time. This is your classic one choke point fight here towards the end. The early game couldn't have been more different down in the settlement over there. Very chaotic, over pretty quickly as well, you'd have to say. You could already see the momentum in that particular engagement, but late game, there goes the Candish General. Hammer's General does fall, and that, yeah, you can see now that there is elements of the Candish force now fleeing, and that is surely going to be that. With that we will, I think, go up to ×2 speed to see us to the end of the battle. Seeing as it is just the one choke point that we are perceiving. Guildsmen continuing to chant. Let's give the Flag Rim their credit, they didn't actually just rout immediately at the culmination of this battle. There's actually quite a few more frames left in this battle than I would have thought. Are those Candish units going to return? I guess technically they are. Though it is going to be clean up at this point. I can't imagine too many more of the defenders are going to fall. 3% the difference though, this has been, considering it did have some narrative limitations to it, this has been quite a compelling and competitive battle. Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen going to be hunted down. Dwarven quality always to be relied upon, and like we said at the start of the battle as well, it's an easy thing to say, but yeah, the Dwarven ability to hold the line, the Dalian ability to do a consistent amount of damage at range over a long period of time, it does make them a really effective combination when defending a position. And so it has turned out to be here. The dwarves are finally tired. It's been a bloody encounter. And technically speaking as well, I mean, the Dwarven General, I believe, is still alive. He does kind of stand out a little bit. I'd imagine he's... doesn't look like he is in the highborn... Oh no, yeah, there he is. So yeah, the Dwarven General and one of the Dalian Generals does still live, so I guess we can say that Dane and Brand on this occasion, unless one of them catches a stray sword right at the death, actually did survive this time around. a better outcome than the real battle during the War of the Ring. And there we have it. Defeat seems certain, only a fool could lose this battle. Well, victory seems certain, only a fool could lose this battle. Nomadic warriors fleeing, still a fair amount of time left. Variag Bowman. Has anything decided to return? Probably not if it's fled all the way back down this hill over here. So to give them their credit here, the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen are going to make Dale work for it, although to be fair it is only Bardi and Marksman that have stayed behind to try and kill them off, so this is where their melee defense is going to really come into play. But yeah, very much a more of a grindy fight towards the second part of it with just the one choke point, but in fairness to the dwarves, it wasn't something that they made too dull. They were very willing to take the front foot, be aggressive with their quality, and not allow the attackers to try and use their throwing projectiles as easily as they would have liked. And that ended up being a massive factor, I think, going forward. So big credit to the Flame of Arnor for playing the dwarves in such a way, especially given the difficult situation the defenders kind of had to find themselves in after the fight in the settlement, from which the attackers would have been fairly pleased, but in the end not able to see themselves through. Overwhelming force being applied, but still 1,000 frames left. They either die by the sword or jump from the cliffs. And they're going to choose, well, not that you can choose otherwise in Medieval 2. I wonder if there would be a way to get into the bowels of the game and make it so that falling off was a possibility. It happens in a buggy fashion to artillery, after all. It's the sort of thing which can actually, I think, be changed, I've heard in the past, but because you have to basically crack into the game, you can't do it on the Steam version. And because Steam is where most people play the game, it kind of renders that an impossibility. And there we have it. Victory. At a heavy cost, but victory nonetheless. We can't actually see the players' names, which is a bit of a shame, but differing fates for everyone. Obviously high amounts of kills for both of the Dalian armies, considering the amount of pressure they had to deal with in the early game. And they didn't allow the attackers to swarm over the settlement and take it free of charge. As much as they were always pretty much on the back foot, they did at least make the attackers pay dearly enough to the point where a victory was possible on the hillside later on, which is of course what the dwarves were the main factor in delivering then. So, well played. I think well deserved from the defenders. As for the attackers, as I mentioned, they actually did several things pretty well. I think their ability to find gaps in defensive lines and manoeuvre themselves into a position that's a little bit more favourable for them, I think was good. And they continued to do that and tried to continue to do that throughout the battle, and as well they should have. Not bad at all from that perspective. They even tried to use their throwing projectiles late on, which would have been like the difference maker, although, like I said, the dwarves and their aggression did make that a little bit more tricky for them. I don't think the attackers did a huge amount immediately wrong, but it's just small things, I guess. And you would say that the attackers didn't lose this battle, the defenders won it, I think is the best way to put that. So let's see what did the damage for the dwarves, of course, seeing the battle from the Flame of Arnor's perspective. Obsidian Guard doing very, very well, of course, in pure melee engagements like this, where they're going up against units which, for the most part, will struggle a little bit more against them. Some of the armour-piercing units from Rhun and Cand will do a bit better, but for the most part they were up against stuff that you would expect them to defeat, and they did handily. 467 and 553, so goes to show that you don't necessarily need to do damage quickly. Dual-wielding units will tend to do their damage more slowly, but if you can keep them supported, keep them alive, keep projectiles off of them, that is the kind of thing that you can expect to see. Axe Guard doing nicely, the Iron for Axe Throwers, we didn't actually see them get too many devastating volleys off, but over the course of the battle they clearly did a decent job. The Pikes, you're not expecting them to get too much in the way of kills in the first place, they're just going to be there as a defensive bulwark. Warriors, Highborns of Erebor late on, also chipping in very nicely. Relatively small army this from the dwarves, but the quality was there. as you would expect, and utilised aggressively. And considering he had by far the smallest army on the field as well, it's not too surprising to see he didn't get as many kills as the Dalians. Dale as well, I would imagine, if we were to have a look at their kills, stuff like the Dalian Royal Guard and especially the Athala Rangers probably managed to fill their boots in terms of kills fairly substantially. So yeah, big thank you to the Flame of Arnor for crafting this scenario and giving this replay to me. I don't know whether he made the map or not. Something tells me I've seen this map somewhere before, but I've seen so many variants on Dale and Erebor and Battle of the Five Armies and War of the Ring at this point that I can't be sure of that. Either way, he definitely made the scenario itself, so big thank you to him, and thank you for giving this one in. He's got another one as well, which I will be showing in the next week or so, I believe, which is a variant on Thranduil's Halls. So just seeing a new version of Thranduil's Halls is something I'm interested to see, because much like Bersergath, that's a map that I've seen so many times at this point in its original form that it's one that I kind of struggle to get excited for, but the fact that it's got some changes means that I'm far more willing to do that one. So that one will be coming out in the next week or so, like I said. Got a new map as well from the Womb Raider. I've got a battle from Winged Swordsman 44. I've still got several that I've got to make my way through from 2 times, so plenty of battle replays here. People have certainly been busy over the festive period and just after the new year, which is great for me. It means that there's going to be plenty of content flowing, certainly in the first part of the year, where hopefully I can work up a big backlog, because as I've already mentioned, I won't mention it at the end of every battle replay, but it does bear repeating, at least initially in this part of the year, that for now things will continue as they will, but as we get into spring, of course, there is going to be a little bit of movement from my perspective, so hopefully it won't be too obvious on the channel itself, because like I said, I want to build up a big backlog, record in advance fairly far, so that if I do have to take like a week or 2 weeks off from recording while everything's moving around, I can, and it shouldn't be too much. I mean, considering the fact that I've been working away for weeks at a time, it's basically the same sort of thing, only from my perspective, slightly more positive reasons this time that it's going to be the case. So yeah, but worth bearing in mind. But for now, the content is looking pretty good. The content will flow, and plenty of new maps as well, by the looks of things, that people are crafting as well, which is good for the game, ahead of sort of keeping the game bobbing along ahead of the new patch, which hopefully will come out at some point this year. So yeah, big thank you to the Flame of Arnor once again. Big thanks to all the players for being a part of this battle replay. I hope you enjoyed this, and hope you'll join me for whatever is next.